This talk is entitled The Grift, the Grind, and the Grunt. And most of the talk is going to be figuring out what exactly I mean by that. The grunt is the Unicode characters, I guess you saw in your email. So the subtitle of this talk is Programming Used to Be Fun, What Happened? And this is my very scientific graph going over the past few decades, kind of my lifetime, where I felt like programming was getting more and more fun as I got older. And then somewhere around 2002 or 2004, suddenly it took a big dip. Retrospectively, I feel like, and I want to find out why. So this is not a language talk, and it's specifically not a Clojure talk. So it's going to be sort of Clojure adjacent, if that's okay with everybody. But we're going to talk about a lot of languages that are very similar to Clojure. Those languages are Common Lisp, which I think people can associate with Clojure. Ruby, so Nina just mentioned that I did a talk about Ruby and Clojure once in the past. Rust, which is popular these days. Perl, of course. Visual Basic 3, C#, and everyone's favorite, SQL. So rather, this is going to be a fairly personal story about losing my passion for software development and finding it again, possibly multiple times, and what this kind of overall dip in my desire to be a programmer means, and how I think that most other people have felt it too, if you've been around for long enough. So for this slide, I searched for born again painting, and it turns up some interesting results. So I particularly liked this idea that I can represent myself as this baby overlooking the entire earth. But I think I would rather be this naked butterfly in a rose being watched over by some sort of omniscient chrono lion. So thank you, Fine Art America, whoever you are. These are great. So you don't get on stage without a little bit of narcissism. So I'm going to go back to my childhood and take us away, Space-Time Lion. So this is the beginning of this process of feeling lost and looking for something, and then feeling like I've found something, and then repeating that experience. So my first contact with computers was at a fairly early age. My father was the principal of the high school in the small town where I lived. And I think I was maybe 3 or 4 when he would set me down in front of a Tandy 1000. And he would open up Talk. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the Unix program Talk. It basically allows two computers to talk. It's sort of a predecessor to IRC. And he would put me in front of the computer, and then he would run away and say like, oh, you're talking to the computer. And he would, of course, go to the other computer that I was talking to, and he would pretend to be the computer. I would ask the computer about my Christmas presents, and the computer would reply politely. And I thought that this was the most magical thing in the world. It was great to go to the school on weekends and play with computers. I didn't actually ever use our Apple IIe, so it doesn't really count. My first proper computer that we had in the household was a 386. And the 386 had all sorts of mysteries to it. So it had Gopher and Archie and Veronica. You could do computer networking with these things. And I found this just fascinating. It was like a magical machine. And the machine itself amazed me. Like, it could do so many things that I felt kind of unbounded. So my first programming language was QBasic, which I think nobody really thinks of as like the greatest programming language ever. But it was my first, and we'll come back to this. First computer means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So if you're older than I am, your first computer might have been an Amiga or a Commodore or a Beeb if you're British. For other people, for younger folks, it might have been the original Mac or a Pentium 3 or an iPhone. So my second computer, my first real kind of computer in a way, was a gateway computer, which came in a box like this. I feel like Gateway sort of showed Apple the way toward beautiful packaging. And you can laugh at Visual Basic all you want, but when I was a kid, like a preteen and an early teen, it was a dynamic language. It had a garbage collector. It provided immediate results, recompilation on the fly, debugging. And I think a lot of those things maybe sound familiar to folks here. I managed to avoid spending my time cleaning up memory addresses or playing the pointer arithmetic game. So even though I knew that C++ was a more powerful language, I tried learning C++ as a kid and failed, as many people do, and kind of found this other route. And so this image in the corner is a game that I made when I was a young teenager over a couple of years. I called it a graphical mud at the time. The term MMO or MMORPG didn't exist or hadn't been coined yet. And I recently got it rerunning on Wine, so this is running on Linux. I found a copy on an old CDR at my parents' house. The experience of building this game as a kid was mostly magical, not because I wanted to make video games, but it was mostly magical because there were other people online doing similar things. So my experience of learning Visual Basic 3 was made magical by communicating with other people who were doing Visual Basic and could teach me tips and tricks. How do I use the WinSock API? How do I use BitBlit? Those sorts of things. And so I really enjoyed Visual Basic at this age where I could just focus on the problem solving of actually building my little game rather than worrying about all these other things like managing memory. And I think that years later, Clojure had a similar appeal. So the STM, persistent data structures, optional functional programming, because Clojure isn't strictly functional, they all prevent us from solving the same problems over and over again, just like garbage collection did prior to Clojure. So I had a coworker who described this as similar to kit cars. So kit cars, I think, are a very American concept. I don't remember them existing in Canada, actually. But a kit car was basically where you ordered the car to your house in a box, and then you would build the car yourself. You can still do this today, but most people don't. You would rather just get the car off the lot and start driving it, because the driving is the fun part. So I did learn C++ eventually, and you'll see Abhinav's talk this afternoon. He is in the process of joining a C++ team, which I think is proof that everyone learns C++ eventually. So my third computer was actually my first proper computer that I owned myself. And I learned C++. I went to university. That was the language du jour that everyone was trying to learn, even though we were all bad at it. Java was kind of around, but nobody respected Java because you couldn't do fancy things with it. In the early 2000s, it was too slow. Linux seemed cool, and I would install it and then uninstall it again and again. And open source was kind of a curiosity. And I was only really beginning to understand this concept of shared software, partly through open source. And so although open source seemed cool at the time, the demo scene seemed much cooler. So for those of you who are not familiar with the demo scene, I won't really try to define it. It is the process of getting together in a group like this and sharing demos with each other. And it sort of seemed beyond me. University at the time was kind of grinding me down. The forced learning about every conceivable tree data structure wasn't that exciting to me. And weirdly, when I would go and do the stuff that I liked, so like .NET and Mono, I would go and read the literature, was like Gang of Four design patterns, and find that that was even worse than my university textbooks. And so the demo scene was sort of this mysterious saving grace. Mono, by the way, is like the original open source .NET framework before Microsoft open sourced parts of the actual .NET framework. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the demo scene, let's hope that this displays correctly. I wanted to show you the first demo that really blew my mind. So this is a demo in 64K, and it's showing on the wrong monitor, so give me a sec. Oh, we didn't Do we have audio? I should have asked. I knew. I should have asked. Well, we can at least, we can watch it. Let's see, I'll turn the speaker all the way up. If you get the sound from this laptop, you get it from the laptop, and I'm sorry. Maybe the HDMI will. Oh, it comes from like nowhere. It's even weirder. I think it's actually going through the HDMI, but there are no speakers. So this is long. I won't play all 7 minutes of this, but I'll play, can you hear this a little bit? I'll play 1 minute of this. Oh, okay. Give me a second. If you set the output to HDMI, we get audio, that's half the experience. Sound, output. Oh yeah, HDMI. Yeah, that's better. Okay, that's enough of that. So the reason that this is amazing to me is because, whoop, oh, I lost track of my slides also. Because I hadn't seen anything like it. So I think probably many of you have seen, well, many of you have probably seen something like this since. This, as far as I'm aware, there were always 64K demos. So part of the demo scene was packing stuff into tiny files. Part of the demo scene was graphics. Part of it was sound. Part of it was weird programming hacks. Can you get, and there's all sorts of stuff that happens now, right? Like, can you get Doom running on like a digital pregnancy test and stuff like that, which of course people have done. But this was released at a demo called, or a demo party called The Party in 2000. And it was the first time I'd seen anything quite like this. So this, at the end of the video, they have a scroller explaining what their compression actually looks like. So obviously most of the hacking that they're doing here is building tools for themselves to do compression of this kind. But this is part of the anticipation of watching this video for the first time. I think on my like little 266 Pentium 2 was waiting for 15 to 20 minutes for it to decompress. Like this program, it's just an exe that you run in Windows because it uses DirectX, would load for ages to decompress all of this stuff and boot itself up so that it would actually play. So they managed to cram almost 2 gigabytes of actual kind of display data and sound data into the 64K. And they call this a compression ratio of like 30,000 to 1, which, I mean, obviously there's a bit of flexibility and definition there, but it was very cool. And so like Farbrush, the team that built this demo, they came out with even cooler things later as like newer versions of DirectX came out and you could do like water effects and translucence and things like that. So this is a little homely by today's standards, but still very impressive, I think. And so this was one of the points in my career that I thought, wow, somebody's doing something really amazing, better than I can ever do, but that's aspirational. So shortly after this, I took my first job, and it was in ASP.NET, which was not that aspirational and not that exciting. And so I quit my job, and I went to RubyConf 2005. RubyConf 2005, again, blew my mind completely. It felt amazing to just go to a conference and be around people who I'd heard about on the internet and their work, and to hear them talk about the things that they were doing. Nothing in my life had made me so excited about programming up until that point as RubyConf 2005 did. And so after this conference, I went and got my second kind of full-time job, worked at ThoughtWorks. And weirdly, the act of programming Ruby day to day as a day job was not as satisfying as I thought it was going to be. So all the kind of magic of Why the Lucky Stiff and these sorts of people doing crazy things on the internet, that's not what it's like to write a Rails app for an insurance company. And I think we're all familiar with this, but I felt like I was a part of something, at least, and I started to learn a new set of rules. So the original set of rules in my computer science education was all about structure, and now this new set of rules was about this kind of flexible structure, TDD, CI. It wasn't called continuous deployment at the time, but CI/CD, inversion of control, all of these sorts of things that people kind of took to be good. And I also participated in the static and dynamic religious wars of the time, and you can probably guess which side I landed on. So while I was at ThoughtWorks, I attended another conference that really blew my mind. This was XTech in Paris in 2007. If you look it up on the internet, there's almost no trace of this conference somehow. I don't know how that happened, but it's kind of been wiped off. But they had very strange talks at this conference. So there was one lady who had like a Nintendo Wii controller, and she used it to lay OpenStreetMaps in 3D and then put her friends' photos geographically on OpenStreetMaps and then navigate it with the Wii controller. And it's like, why would you do that? Why not? Like, just for fun. There were people advocating for microformats so that you could share your recipes with semantic data without worrying about RDF. QR codes were laughed at the time. We use them every day now with UPI and things like that. But it was people advocating for taking QR codes and making them the connection between the digital world and the physical world. That happened, and we just kind of take that for granted. There was a lot of talk about digital identity, which I would argue is still an unsolved problem. And there was a lot of talk about this concept of ubiquitous computing, which I would also say is an unsolved problem. It's a problem that's emerging almost in such a liquid way that we don't really notice that it's happening. This conference was interestingly structured. There were 3 tracks, but one of those tracks was a honeypot. And so halfway through the conference, I asked, what is the deal? There are 2 tracks, and they're very cool. It's like OSM plus Wii controller and like microformats over here. And then this 3rd track is, how do we solve problems with CSS? Like, what about HTTP 1.1? Like all these weird standardization talks. And somebody explained, oh, that's actually on purpose. All of the Microsoft and Opera and Mozilla people, they get attracted to that really boring track that's all about standards, and they yell at each other all day, and they leave us alone to hang out in the 2 cool tracks. And I'm actually tempted to believe that we should always run conferences this way. Really, like, put a honeypot track for the people that are just there to like pitch things and do corporate stuff, and we can have fun tracks somewhere else. I recently had a friend tell me that conferences, at least that he's been to recently, or that he's pitched talks for recently, have this concept of accepting talks based on what is useful on the following Monday morning. Screw that. I think that's a terrible, terrible way to run conferences. I don't think that we should, or you can have a separate honeypot conference for that kind of junk, right? But like, I think we should run conferences where we're talking about something that actually becomes a reality like 13 years later, like QR codes did here. That's exciting to me. So ubiquitous computing is not terminology that people generally use. We probably have other kind of smaller terms for that sort of thing, like IoT and stuff like that today. But this book actually presents the problem in clear relief and gives a lot of interesting solutions. And I would highly recommend reading it. It's still applicable decades on. So then I left that conference, I left ThoughtWorks, I joined DRW Trading, and again, I was surprised to find that the union of my religions, so I had this new religion of Clojure, and I'd really kind of invested myself in Linux and open source. I fully believed in these things, that it wasn't satisfying. And partly I blamed finance. It's like, oh, working in finance, that must be the problem. And I had this kind of existential crisis. But along the way, I did go to ClojureCon in 2010. And I won't list all these talks because you can still go to this URL and find them all. But I don't know how many people actually seen Are We There Yet? But I didn't go to the JVM Languages Summit and see it in person. I saw it online. But the moment I saw it, I was completely sold. The time model, the immutability model, the software transactional memory, the idea that all of this is baked into a Lisp and you made the Lisp slightly prettier with some square brackets. Like, everything about Clojure appealed to me, and still does. But I was deeply sold at the time. And so there was a blog post around this time period where somebody advocated, choose your QBasic. So he or she, I don't remember, and I can't find the blog post now, was saying, like, if you like PHP, go deep on PHP. Just learn the heck out of PHP. If you know Java, go deep on Java and just make that the language that you know like the back of your hand. And for me, I wanted this to be Clojure. I wanted to solve every problem in Clojure. And it was definitely my new religion, and I held on to it for a long time. And with that religion came some new rules. So some of those rules were, I flip-flopped. Whoops, sorry. TDD bad, frameworks bad, metaprogramming bad, surprisingly, despite all the access to macros, like, oh, there they are, but they're the dark arts, don't use them. And tiny libraries, good. It always must be this way. And so I had a new set of rules to live by, and I had a new religion to live by, and so I marched out into the world. And while I was at this conference, there are a lot of kind of notable quotes, but this one actually isn't in any of the videos, I don't think, because it's Michael Fogus introducing somebody else, or he's introducing the conference, I forget. But it really sticks out in my mind because he jokes, I didn't title my book, The Joy of Connecting to a MySQL Database. And everything that is salient to me about Clojure is kind of summed up in that one sentence. So MySQL and Clojure, where does joy come from? Well, I would say that cooking is a kind of hacking, and I feel like surely this book title has some influence on their book title. Cooking involves both discovery and creation in an attempt to create something beautiful. And this, of course, is not the joy of Clojure that we're really talking about. We're talking about this dirty old rascal from the first edition. And this is not, many of you may have read The Joy of Cooking or seen this book around. Probably Blossoms, I'm sure, has like dozens of copies of this copy. But we're not talking about this one. We're talking about the first edition of The Joy of Cooking, which had this cover that I can't believe that they got rid of. So the artwork is by Irma's daughter, Marion. And it depicts Martha of Bethany, the patron saint of cooking, taming the dragon Tarask. And I think that it's notable that she tames the dragon and doesn't destroy the dragon. But we'll maybe come back to that later. Also, it's probably worth noting that this is a very kind of friendly-looking Tarask. There are meaner-looking Tarasks. So this is from D&D. So with my Clojure religion, I went off and helped found this company called Nilenso. I forced everyone to use Clojure because religion, and then we all lived happily ever after, which, of course, is not true. Nilenso has gone through some changes over the years. This is the old logo, the new logo. I hear they're still involved in Clojure somehow, a bit. I left Nilenso in 2018, and I started to kind of reflect on my history here and saw that I was going up and down, finding a religion, losing my religion, finding another religion, losing my religion. And I also was reflecting that every good religion has its messiah. not all good messiahs. So you'll note that there are a couple, there's a double messiah. Some messiahs are problematic. You'll also note that each religion gets a much cleaner and smoother looking SVG logo as the decades roll on. You'll also notice that Visual Basic is shrink wrapped. I stole this as a teenager, and I hated that feeling. I think at the time I felt like I hated the feeling because Whereas was just really annoying. I was on like a 33.6 dial-up connection and I had to connect to FTP websites to Seal software, and this was a waste of my time, but I really wanted Visual Basic 3 and 4. But I also really hated the feeling, even at that young age, of doing the opposite of sharing. Like I wasn't sharing, I was stealing. So there's something to the core of this that has to do with sharing. But it also has to do with flexibility and creation and discovery and puzzle solving, making the computer do something cool. And in the Ruby case, very clearly, being nice, which I feel like we've maybe lost over the past 15 years. So there was this kind of classic tagline for the Ruby community, Mats is nice, so we are nice. And I wish a little bit that that was like more common. And it feels like there are spaces where it's becoming more common. There was also a lot of levity to these things. So is this what I mean by grunt? Well, we'll come back to this. In 2006, something weird happened. This little guy. And so now we're getting to the Grift. And I want to caveat this, that this isn't meant to be wholly critical. We all do this, and we all do it to varying degrees. So I'm not meaning that this is something evil or something that we should look down upon, but it does have a negative connotation. So what do I mean by the Grift? I think the hashtag on the top is the most obvious, right? Like crypto, pure grift, there's nothing but grift. But as we move down, AI, a lot of people would claim that the current state of AI is like, everybody's just a grifter and it's just the latest new thing. And it's like, that's not true. There's a lot of interesting work being done in AI and specifically LLMs at the moment. And then as we go further down, there's a gossamer one here, which is hashtag build in public. And I am being critical of build in public here. I think that it's more insidious to co-opt the language of creativity and sharing and learning and community to sell things. I don't think that there's anything wrong with selling things, but I think that there is something wrong with doing it in a dishonest way. And the issue with the grift here is that people have kind of come to sell themselves in this way. And so I call this influencer soup. This is kind of taking the world of influencers on one side, which we all know is kind of, there's good and bad, but there are definitely some serious issues over there. And then taking the world of sharing and collaboration and community and somehow stewing these together. And the result's not always that nice. So I would say that this situation has gotten so bad that someone wrote a book on it. So this book, Working in Public, The Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software. If you read my Goodreads review of this book, it is not nice, and I won't rehash that here. But the primary issue with what happened in society, as far as I'm concerned, and what happened inside the scope of this book, is that we began to conflate performative acts with sharing. Like these are very different things. And from what I remember, the last chapter of this book doesn't even talk about open source. It talks about LinkedIn and Twitter and Reddit, but it doesn't talk about code. It doesn't talk about programming. And that is a smell to me. So it also got so bad that we lost track of the meaning of words. So I had a coworker in recent years say, the OSI doesn't define what the term open source means. No one can. I don't see why we can't consider the SSPL to be open source. They literally write the open source definition. That's the thing that they do. So if you're so like unconfident about what words mean, and the people who came up with those words, like that term was coined by this group, you're kind of losing touch with reality, I think. It got so bad that people started telling untruths. So these are organizations that do not use open source licenses, but they claim on their websites that they are open source. It got so bad that people wrote these licenses. So these are generic, not open source licenses that kind of frame themselves in the world of open source. These licenses are fizzle and boozle, and they're here to solve the problem of free riders. But you can usually tell a license is bad when it includes the word source in the license. Also, the boozle is not a license, it's just a license template, so you have to fill out some text and then you have to run it by your lawyer because you effectively created a new license from scratch. So this is good to know because a lot of people don't do that. Am I obsessing over open source? Maybe. But I pick on open source here because that was unfortunately for a certain group of people, we didn't choose free software, right? Because it's problematic and you wind up translating that into different languages and stuff to solve the problem. Open source is a nice, clean term, and we kind of used it to codify the idea of sharing. And because we had open source and because we had open source codified, we get things like Ruby and like Clojure and Linux, before them. So I think this idea of codifying how we share things is actually useful. I also want to make an aside that open source has a definition. The English word open has a lot of definitions and it has a lot of flexibility. So if you're looking to the future of open ideas and open sharing, I think Carlos Viela is a lawyer who's been working in open source for decades. He has this newsletter. I don't care that much about AI. This is the only thing I read about AI. His take is great. It's balanced. He's very thoughtful. He has a lawyer's perspective. And he writes really well. It's interesting. And so the summary of his take is basically, I don't know, I can't predict the future. So let's just wait and see. But here are the details as the thing progresses along. So it also got so bad that I would argue the hype ate itself. So we had these exhausting hype cycles that I think most of us have probably checked out of. So there was a Web 2 hype cycle, and then a mobile hype cycle, and then especially in Asia, a gig economy hype cycle, and then a crypto hype cycle, and then an AI hype cycle, and maybe in the future, a local first hype cycle. Who knows? But these things, I feel like, tired us out. And so a lot of us don't want to get excited about things anymore because we're burnt out on the idea of getting excited, because people are like, you need to be excited 16 hours a day. Like, only when you're asleep are you allowed to not be excited about the latest fad. I should also point out the things on the right, they have their own hype cycles. They don't directly correspond to the things on the left, but they sort of follow the same rough chronological timeline. And I don't know if we burn out on hype around tech as much, but I feel like some of us do. So I wanted to use a concrete example, and excuse me, sorry for breathing into the mic like that. I didn't want to pick on anybody, like from out in the world. It's hard to say, like, this is what I mean when I say grift, and I don't necessarily mean that this is evil or like wrong, it's just kind of gross. And so Kitty posted this yesterday as a joke, and then this morning I was like, actually, I could just rip that off. I don't think he's going to get offended that I used his joke as an example of grift. This is what I mean, except the numbers at the bottom would be like 30,000 retweets or whatever for this absurd comment. So let's move on to the grind, which is a different category of work. So here are some clockwork gnomes. They just go about doing their tasks. I think we're all familiar with this. It changes from culture to culture, right? So in Japan, it's a sarariman. In the United States, it's no vacation, no sick leave, no parental leave, no like maternity leave. In China, it's 996. And in India, it's actually slightly different. It's this progression, and I am very sorry, Randall Munro, for stealing your image, but this is the greatest possible image I could think of for this. Also, the years don't line up, just ignore that. But I think in India, there's this progression from when you're like a young child to college, where it's like that is the grind, and you finally get through college and you actually get to your job, and your job might not be that satisfying, but it's an escape from all that other stuff. Like, at least you're not going through like entrance exam factory stuff anymore. So there's a softer side to all of this. It's not as though the grind is only 996, right? There are a lot of us that probably fall in this category, who are like, the newest kind of fun thing, I want to learn that, I want to get a job with that, and that seems okay, it's not so bad. But there's also this. So I heard another complaint from another friend recently about attending conferences, and it's just people like begging each other for jobs because it's 2023 or 2024. But like 3 years ago, it would have been the opposite, right? It would have been the recruiters hovering around like vultures and be like, do you need a job? Like, do you want to come work for my company? These are the same, they're just the reverse. And they're neither of them that fun. Like, you need a job, okay, but so I think that both of these things live on a spectrum, right? Like, there's a measurement of kind of badness or unpleasantness to these things. They're not being like wholly critical of any of it. So I gave this talk to some friends, and they were like, where's the line? Like, when is it grift? I'm like, there's no line. It's a spectrum from one side to the other. Obviously, crypto, totally grift, build in public. Maybe somebody uses that hashtag and really means it, right? But there are a lot of people that are doing it. They have hired like a small army of consultants, and they're not actually building anything themselves. And I was kind of like, well, that's dishonest. And I would say that there's this spectrum for the grind, right? So if you haven't seen All India Rank, it's pretty good. I enjoyed it. I'm going to ruin it for you. One of these characters commits suicide while preparing for the entrance exams at IIT, right? That's the extreme, and I'm not really talking about that extreme. I'm talking about this stuff kind of, actually, I think I have these misordered. Probably the whatchamacallit, the rust goes on the far right side. Like, that's the least extreme. And this like badgering each other to get jobs is kind of in the middle. Sorry about that. I should review my slides. So I think that for a while, for me, it felt like all the people that I wanted to be around went into hiding, or they gave up and switched careers. They became like sailors or whatever, or they started very private clubs, and they went and hid in their private clubs of like 50 or 100 people, but they weren't sharing things with the world anymore. And that felt sad to me, and I didn't understand why, really, at the time, that the communities I used to feel like I was a part of, or at least watching, seemed to be disappearing. And I partly blame these two things, kind of working in conjunction, to do away with some of the nice stuff that we used to have. And so that takes us to the grunt. And what do I mean by the grunt? I don't really mean a spell book. It wouldn't be a closure conference without some definitions, but usually they come first, not last. So this is grunt, as in Sanskrit. If you just look up a straight definition, it's usually treatise, but it can also mean like a book or scripture. It's from grut, so like knot, binding, tying together. And it also has these other definitions, so like repairing, restoring, weaving things together, and I like all of these definitions at once. So apologize for my pronunciation on this if anyone is feeling critical about that. Also, this is a totally unrelated side note. If you are ever in charge of I-18N on a project, please use the ISO 639-2 three-letter codes, because there are certain languages like Newari that you can only represent with the three-letter codes, and it's very annoying to have someone encode things with the two-letter codes. So that's why SAN, and that's why PLI is Pali. So Pali, for those who don't know, is like a contemporary sister language to Sanskrit, roughly the same time period. Pali is a Prakrit, and probably a compositional language, but we won't go into that. So here in Pali, the grunt is actually gata. So this is like a verse or a shloka. And so we have like gata pada. So also, don't be accidentally critical of my pronunciation of Pali. Pali does not elide trailing incidental vowels. Sandhi doesn't work the same way in Pali as it does in Sanskrit and Hindi. Pada is a footstep or a word. And so Theravada is the hymns of the elders. And that's actually the definition that I want to take from this. But so just to roll on with Thera for a second, that's also where you get like Theravada as a derivative. And so there's kind of like a whole space there. So this will be our usage for the remainder of the talk, is kind of like the hymns of the elders, scripture, how we communicate things to future generations, and then also the weaving and binding and tying of words together. So there's a programming language joke here that I'm not going to tell. And this is maybe the closest thing that I could say is like the actual grunt, if you want to point to a specific book. I read this at the beginning of the pandemic when it was still like 2 months in and everyone's like, any day now, it should stop. So I read Hackers and couldn't believe I hadn't read it before. It's the account of the early days of computers when you only had access to one giant computer in MIT, and then on to like Kathy Sierra building video games like in her living room or wherever she wrote them at home. There's this kind of cool progression that involved this desire to share things with other people. So the classic image from Hackers is that of the MIT AI lab hackers all kind of just rotating through the lab and putting the slips that represented the programs into the drawer. And it's just like, where are all the programs? They're there in the drawer. And you take someone else's program and you modify it and you get this cool kind of liquid programming that I don't even think we have today with things like open source. So, but the grunt is also this. So it's the amazing experience of touching a machine for the first time and being totally in awe. And again, this might be a Tandy 1000 or a 386, but it might also be an iPhone. Like the iPhone is an incredible piece of machinery. It has a GPS in it. It has a gyroscope in it. It has all these weird things that a Tandy 1000 did not. It can be the inspiration of a totally ephemeral and goofy project, like a demo in 64K, or it can be the inspiration of a massive project like half a dozen or a dozen people trying to re-implement all of Microsoft's .NET framework as open source. It can be your own goofy little project that you feel that is worth your time and worth investing in, regardless of what age you are and for whatever reason. And it can be literal books, of course, books that you feel give you the tools that you need to actually get work done, this kind of passing down of knowledge to future generations, kind of in the literal. So really here, what I'm trying to get at is taking this kind of concrete, static image of the grunt, the book that someone gives you or that you buy and you read their words and you learn from them, to what can we do together? And how can we kind of go back to that sense of enjoyment of building things together? And I picked this card. I like it. It was the only card I could find where she takes on all the strength of all the other creatures in play on her team, obviously. It's Magic the Gathering. It's still combative. But I like that her name is the Heedless One. This idea that like you're just kind of plowing into the future without any real like caution for where you're headed with this. I think that that's great. So can we move from this simple sharing to sort of fully combinatorial growth where our strength is derived from everyone else around us? And I wonder if we can't take the old, the full phrase is embrace, extend, extinguish, and I don't really think that you can ever extinguish the grind or the the Grift. They're not going anywhere. But can we exploit them? So can we add this idea, this abstract idea of the grunt to the grind and the Grift to get something out of it? So this is my Grift. This is the project that I work on right now. It's called Endatabas. It's a database written in Common Lisp and Rust. We use the SBCL. So I said I would mention Rust. Sorry. It uses SBCL, which has been released monthly since 1999. Speaking of gifts from the elders. It's licensed BSD and public domain in a combination, which I would argue is like objectively better than the EPL 1.0. EPL 1.0 is a copyleft license. So sorry, Clojure, but it also produces native binaries, which is pretty cool. It has a massive, powerful dynamic runtime, a surprisingly good GC for the small team that's been working on it for ages, and a familiar, for Clojure developers, if slightly odd, development experience. And so I also promised I would talk about SQL. So this database is an SQL database, and Hakan, my colleague, his stated goal for NDB is to bring the joy and dynamism of Clojure and Lisp to SQL. So let's see if that's doable. So this is an example that a friend gave to me. He's like, if I have these two documents, so this is a slight modification of standard SQL syntax where you can just jam a document in directly. It's also a document database. If I have these two documents, can you write me a query where I select out one of the subdocuments? So this feels like a fairly Clojure-y sort of thing. But this line of SQL at the bottom is using a common table expression, unnest, and match over a recursive recursive syntax inside of the query. That ... notation is the only non-standard SQL in this query. So SQL itself has some of these abilities, but you can just give it a little bit of a push to make it a little more Clojure-y. Is that Clojure-y? Is probably quite a bit more concise and readable in Clojure, but it gives you the document back. Is this a good idea? I have no idea. Maybe not. But I think that it's fun to try these sorts of things. So NDB is open source, obviously. Everyone has been shouting at open source for like half an hour if it wasn't. And I think that you can sort of find this middle ground between these two things, where you can sell something, you can sell yourself, you can sell your product. You can grind a little. I write the documentation for NDB. It's not like the most fun job in the world, but somebody has to do it. And you can still share things with people. So I would encourage you to read the source code. It's very wacky. It binds Rust and Common Lisp, which is not that easy a thing to do, and it's kind of cool that it does it. But there are all sorts of other much bigger, great things happening right now. And there was a hopeful kind of uptick in my what happened to the fun in programming graph, my very scientific graph. And it feels like things are ticking up right now. So I would say Framework Laptop is interesting to me, and I really hope it's available in India soon. The local first scene, this idea that all the people I wanted to be around went into hiding, they all seem to be like emerging from the woodwork in the space of local first. And I think part of the reason is it's hard to monetize local first. So there are like these Web3 people hanging around. You can just avoid them or ignore them or whatever. But local first itself is quite cool, and there's a lot of stuff going on there. A lot of kind of deep tech, but there's a lot of sort of user-facing stuff as well. I think we're revisiting the open web. So people are getting back to blogs and RSS and just like making something without the purpose of becoming an influencer or getting followers or whatever. And ActivityPub is obviously a part of this, though I don't know how long that will last. I think there are a lot of people advocating right now for sustainable open source, which is a good thing. Like people should be able to pay their mortgage or their rent and work on open source all day. I really believe that. I think another good example is Rust. Like Rust is a very community-driven, sharing-driven, like collective effort that is now in the Windows kernel and soon to be in the Linux kernel. This is a huge undertaking and a high bar to clear. But on the opposite end from Rust is Raku, which every time I see someone mention Raku on Mastodon or Twitter or wherever, The only mentions of Raku I see are just like, wouldn't it be neat to see if this is possible? Like, nobody is trying to make Raku a new kernel language. Nobody is trying to make it the new language that everybody switches over to. They're just doing it for fun. And I think that that's great. And I miss stuff like that. And it feels like in the last couple of years, we've had a bit of a comeback. And so on this list, I actually want to include LLMs, because I think that LLMs get a bad rap, and that's actually unfair. For those of you who haven't read We Have No Moat, it's a great piece of art, in my opinion. The idea that because a ragtag group of global software developers just kind of smashed at the same models and the same algorithms for like weeks and weeks on end, that Google and probably OpenAI would argue that they don't have a moat around AI. In my opinion, that's a great thing. Like, I'm not going to shed any tears for trillion-dollar companies finding that they don't have a way to wedge more money out of us with a new technology. Or maybe they will, whatever, but it doesn't really matter. Like, I think the existence of that space where people are just sharing and building something out of passion and out of curiosity, that's a thing that I've really missed. And so I think that that's nice. By the way, Raku, for those who don't know, is kind of Perl. So I promised I would mention Perl. I mentioned Perl. So some of these new things are even Clojure related. So obviously, we all love Babashka if you're writing Clojure right now. Clojure Dart, you might love soon if you want to do things in Flutter. There's all sorts of work that's been done in the runtime and editor space in Clojure over the last few years that every time I revisit it, I'm amazed how much has been accomplished. And then there's completely insane projects like Humble UI. And so I'm not going to enumerate everything here, but if you go and look at the Clojure news, it's like every 2 weeks, there's still stuff happening. It feels kind of quiet, but I think that in some ways, Clojure is this sort of calmer, more rational software development community in some ways. And I still like that about it. And I still like all the qualities of Clojure itself that I've always loved. But not just Clojure, you can also enjoy the really old stuff. So Clojure itself is bedrock stable. And I mean that also about its ideas. So like the immutability and choice laziness, data-oriented programming, and the fact that you can mostly get by with just vectors and maps, and like 90% of programs can just use those two collection types and use them in every function. All of this is great stuff. It's always been great stuff. It doesn't get any less great as time goes on. So that's cool. But Common Lisp is also pretty weird and fun. And I would encourage you to go try it. Like, it's shockingly stable and like very accessible, actually. Surprisingly nice for something that you would kind of think of as like a rotting old lemon. But maybe don't go try Visual Basic 6. So my first conclusion here is, although I've never worked for Amazon or Infosys, I'm hopeful for a world where software developers across the board can enjoy the work they do because they're sharing something that they feel is special, that they feel is worth doing, and that they're doing something that they believe matters. So it's kind of like sharing with their coworkers, sharing with the outside world, and doing something that maybe isn't, a trading platform. I don't know. I apologize if anybody's still in finance. It's perfectly fine to do finance if you find it enjoyable. So there are many vehicles that we could use to get here, but the one that I keep advocating terminology for is third wave commercial open source, because I still think that open source does a great job of codifying the idea of sharing ideas, sharing code, maybe sharing models one day, who knows. And third wave commercial open source looks like this to me. So the first wave, I think, is taking other people's work and just shrink wrapping it, putting it in a box, slapping the Red Hat logo on it, and selling it to big corporations. The second wave is building your own thing, but making it open core or making it tightly licensed so that you can dual license or any of those sorts of things. And the third wave, I would say, is mostly SaaS, right? It doesn't move away from the original two waves. It encompasses them. So the third wave includes these other two waves and adds a bunch of other stuff, as well as probably the AGPL v3 and dual licensing based on that, and possibly other things in the future as well with licenses that don't exist now. And there might be new ways of commercializing open source, but making it a little bit more friendly. And so I drew this for a talk that partly talked about commercial open source. Ignore the circle around NDB. NDB is not actually important here. There was a talk about NDB. But notice Clojure's position. Like, I think that there's this attitude that I hear now when people are like, oh, the FSL or the Boozle or whatever, these like made up licenses that don't really mean anything and they'd probably be gone in 5 to 10 years. That when you talk about actual open source, people obsess about the lower left corner. They're like, oh, it has to have a huge community and it has to be community driven and it has to be like purely altruistic, this like selfless delivery of source code to other people. No, it doesn't. Like you can be Apache Cassandra, it can be Clojure, right? Like Clojure is still a copyright owned by one man, right? Like this is not a purely community-driven thing. And of all the things that Rich has ever produced, one of my favorite is a response to a comment someone else made online, which was directed at him, so it's justified that he replied. But the title of his post was, "Open source is not about you." And he basically just tore through that person saying, I made Clojure, I released it, who are you? Like, take it or leave it. It's there for you. You can enjoy it. Enjoy the thing I've shared, but like, don't come down on me because I'm not doing the thing that you want. And I think that that's a perfectly acceptable attitude and position to take. And so I also think that all the other attitudes and positions on this graph are valid to take. You can share however you want to share. Be nice. Try to be nice. Rich wasn't that nice in that post, but he was being defensive, I think, because someone else is being not nice to him. Try to be nice. Try to share with people. Try to do community, but do community however you do community. You don't have to do it the same way as everybody else. You don't have to be an Apache project. You don't have to be a nonprofit. So my second conclusion is just in general, share, have fun. If you're only worried about whether someone's employer is paying for their conference tickets, maybe don't run a conference. Like, run the conference because you want to hang out with your friends and make new friends. Run the conference because you want to hear about something cool. Run the conference because you want to create a space for people, not because you want to create some like mediocre job machine. Or if you do, advertise it as that. Be like, this is the job machine conference and like, that's the honeypot from XTech. But also, so that's as a group, and conferences are one example. We have other things, right? Like we have other spaces, but I won't go through all of them. But individually, blog, release source code, make videos and put them on YouTube. Like go to hackathons, try cooking, right? Do whatever you want to do, but I would argue try more and more to do it because you want to. Not because you feel like you need to impress somebody, not because you feel like you need to add followers to your whatever account. Do it because you get some joy out of it, and I think that you'll be happier and the people around you will be happier. So thank you. That was 46 minutes, so we maybe have a minute or two for questions, but I think we also started late, so maybe it's up to Nina. We have time. I don't know if anybody has questions about a talk like this, or just like, what is there's no code except for SQL.
Can you expand a little on ubiquitous computing? Didn't get too much.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, I'm going to take a drink of water first. So ubiquitous computing is this idea, it literally is what it says on the tin. So this idea that like, there are all sorts of little technologies that have come along that have tried to put technology into everything. So the two examples I would point out now are like IoT devices, which we usually think of as being like low energy consumption, very tiny, publishing lots of like boring repetitive events. And the other is like smart X, right? Smart TV, smart toaster, smart watch, whatever. So ubiquitous computing says, like, this is a trend that is never going to stop, right? You're going to get smart chairs, you're going to get smart walls, you're going to get everything, doors, especially he talks about at length in the book. You're going to get all sorts of things emerging commercially that bake computing into every aspect of our lives. And so some of that stuff is hardware, like IoT devices and a door that doesn't unlock if you don't have the right private key or whatever, hopefully, instead of like some proprietary solution. But it's also this kind of like ubiquitous nature of like data and algorithms and stuff that we have a sense of this. Like, it's definitely in the news. It's this kind of like, oh, what does Facebook know about you? What does Bombora? So I don't know how many of you have heard of Bombora. If you have ever worked in sales, you will hear about this company, Bombora. There's a reason that you don't hear about it. They're extremely shady, much shadier than Facebook or LinkedIn or any of these things. Basically, they just stalk people online. That's all they do. And then they will notify you as a salesperson to say, like, this person has been Googling for stuff that's adjacent to your product, and they've been over here, they attended this conference, they're ready to buy your thing. Go reach out to them now, here's their contact information. It's awful. So I had like a sales guy pitch this to me once, and I was like, I already do not like LinkedIn Sales Navigator. I don't want this garbage. Like, this is actually evil. This is one of the few times in life where I can say, like, over here is good, and over here is evil, and I will choose not to go on that side, please. So those sorts of things where data and like privacy become huge issues in like every aspect of society, that's ubiquitous computing. And it's just this like continuous progression. Like nobody gets to escape back to the woods and like hide from ubiquitous computing. And so his point in the book is kind of like, let's think about this problem, but like, let's think about it in advance, which we didn't do, because I think he released that book in like 2006 or 2005 or something. And we haven't been talking about this until it's too late. It's always like, oh no, catastrophe, privacy violation, like we should do something about that. And then we don't, we forget about it. So that's why I like it as a book, is it's not really focused on, it's not like Cambridge Analytica or, oh no, Facebook started another genocide. It's like, here's the abstract problem for you to think about and for you to apply to the work that you actually do in your day job. And like, what are the programming models that you subscribe to? What are the security models that you subscribe to? What are the threat models that you're concerned about? What are the failure modes? If you don't have your private key, is there another way to open the door? Stuff like that. Does that answer the question?
I'm wondering if the fun in programming goes up and down with the state the society is in. Do you see a correlation there?
It could, right? Like so I think that those societies that we would maybe argue are more stable than North America, where I was born, or India, where probably most of the people in this room were born. Like Sweden and Denmark and things like that. Like maybe they've just had the same amount of fun like for 40 years. I don't know. I think that there's definitely an intersection here between societal things, like things that are happening in society. So this was influencer soup, right? Where it's like, there's an issue over here that is a generic issue or a specific issue. If the specific issue is teenagers are getting depressed because they feel like they need to make something of themselves in social media, if the other side is that now we feel like we need to sell everything through this new channel, we need to figure out how we can become important in these ways, and we blend these together, are you going to get depressed about the Raku code that you're writing or not writing because people didn't retweet your thing enough times? Maybe, and that's definitely societal influence. So I think that there's no escaping that, but I also feel like to some degree, so I watched a Y Combinator video to my shame, the other night, and Michael What's-His-Face was advocating, he's like, I just tell founders to get off of media, to stop going to conferences, to things that like give them bad ideas. Like I tell them what the bad ideas are. He's talking about like thinking like a financier instead of thinking like a software developer or like a founder, which is a totally different case. But it's interesting to me that he just tells people like, delete your account. Stop going to that conference. Stop talking to these people. Like they're a bad influence. This is actually a thing that I remember from the 80s when I was like 8. And I would make a shady friend and my mom would be like, maybe you only get to hang out with that friend once a month because they seem to be taking you to weird places and feeding you dangerous things. And I'm worried about the drugs or whatever. I think that we have a lot of agency to just kind of set all this stuff aside. So even though society is an influence on us all the time, that when it comes to these things, like if we want to enjoy Rust or enjoy Raku or enjoy Clojure in 2024, like it's 14, 15 years on, Clojure's getting kind of like old and it has a different feel to it now, that we can enjoy them in a different space entirely. We don't have to enjoy them in the same way that people are enjoying crypto or whatever.
I have one more question related to nilenso towards a
Where am I looking? Oh, hi.
So actually, I was working on one project related to that only. Indian or many part of the country, people have lots of people are coming from colleges. They don't have jobs. Even there is lots of pressure from the society and parents also that they will get a job. Is cooperative will help in the tech industry to even the freshers to get into livelihood at least and live the remaining life, maybe spending time in the whatever conferences or whatever the open sources initiative they want to be contributed, or maybe a variation of cooperative or subdivision of cooperatives that might help here.
So I'd actually, sorry, was that the whole question?
It's enough.
Okay. I would actually advocate that in the same way that I put like the grift and the grind on a spectrum, I would put cooperatives on a spectrum. So internationally, there are a lot of different cooperatives. There are a lot of different corporate models in general. So I've been quite happy with some of the B Corps that have come out of the United States, for instance. So Canada doesn't have B Corps, India doesn't have B Corps, but they're a new kind of middle ground between C Corps or private limiteds and nonprofits, where they have a stated social goal. Like they want to do something for the world, for society, but they're doing it with a for-profit company. I think that that's neat. And that's a fairly new concept, like it's been around for maybe a decade or something. I think that all the different kinds of cooperatives that you can have, there are also things that are cooperative-like, that involve a lot of cooperation, but are not specifically cooperatives. So I actually think that, for instance, a friend of mine is trying to start a consultancy, and he's not going to start a cooperative. And he was asking, how do I get away from solo one-person consulting to running a consultancy? He's like, I don't want to be an employee on contract. I want to be a consultant, and I want to be able to like move people around, hire people into my consultancy. And so what I told him was, I know a lot of friends started with an umbrella consultancy, where really like the name of the business it's just the facade on the building. It doesn't really mean anything. And individually, people inside are doing work effectively as individuals, but like collaborating together. They share an office space often, especially now that people are often remote. And you can get together with friends and build something like that. It doesn't have to be, like a cooperative is kind of the other end of the spectrum. It's about the institution. Like people come and go, the cooperative remains indefinitely, and it kind of maintains its own state. Whereas, well, whatever the state is changing, but it maintains its title. Whereas an umbrella is just a way to get people together and do some maybe more interesting work than you could do solo. And I think if people are finding it difficult to find jobs, especially right now, right, this huge downturn, and then probably in 2 or 3 years, everything will flip back around again. I don't know. That like during a downturn like this, that people can essentially do this, right? Like share, learn to cooperate, get together with other people. It doesn't have to last forever, but it can be something that you do yourself without trying to march out to Amazon or Wipro or whoever and like beg for jobs. Like you can go find those jobs yourself. I realize that's easier said than done, especially for college students, but it is doable. And I think that every idea on the spectrum of how to structure yourself as an organization or as a shell of an organization or even as an individual, they're all good. Like I would prefer to see more diversity in that space in the way that people structured their corporations and the way that they structured their groups than for everything to become a monoculture. And it's like, everybody's a private limited. Everybody incorporates in Delaware. Everybody incorporates in Singapore, right? Like doing the same thing over and over again is part of what makes life boring and you enter one of these dips. So if you can do something new, weird, kind of cool, I think that that's good. A cooperative could be one of those ideas, but I certainly not like the be-all, end-all.
Thanks, Stephen, for walking us through the different communities and the kind of the feel that you get out of it. Especially on the Ruby community, you had suggested that the niceness part and coming back to closure on that front. How is that, I'll say, in parallel to the Ruby community? That's one. And second, especially as a religion, you will have fanatics, you will have early adopters, and you will have believers. So how do you maintain that niceness and ensure that because like the Messiah is like not writing everything?
I think that you'll have to excuse me. Sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. I think that I struggle to point to individuals, but I hope that this is okay. I hadn't met Bork Dude before, Michel Borkent, until the very last Strange Loop. So like the most recent Strange Loop, but also the last Strange Loop forever. So Strange Loop was like, it was quite a fun conference, and Alex felt that it like ran its time. And Bork Dude was there, and like I had vegan tacos with him. And he's one of these people, right? Like the balance is crazy. Like I would say that being not nice it's not just the grift, it's not just like convincing people that you're good without actually doing anything or building anything. But it's like hot takes and like tearing down other people's stuff. Like I think that that's not nice. And I've done this before. I have regretted doing it in the past. I've even done it in the Clojure community and very much regretted it. And I would say that that's kind of the worst of the grift. And Bork Dude's sort of the other end of the spectrum, right? Like he'll post things online, but he's just sort of like, I released a new version of like Sci or whatever. SCI, I'm not sure how you pronounce it even. But he's just like making things all the time, and he's just happy to be making things. And he's just like a friendly, nice guy who wants to talk to you about the things that you've done. And I think that he's a great example from the Clojure community of what you would hope to find more and more of in the Clojure community. You don't necessarily need to write a whole new interpreter, right? Like you can write a library. You could break the rules and write a framework, which I think is actually not a bad idea, personally. But you can kind of engage with the community and you can enjoy the community. And I think from RubyConf 2005, I actually have a great example of what it really means to be nice, is not just being nice to the people that are immediately around you, but if you saw on the list of talks, there was one real outlier, right? It was a biologist who built undersea robots, and he controlled them with Ruby. And it was kind of like everybody else is like introducing JRuby and like DSLs and stuff like that. And while he was giving his talk, there was no Slack back then, thankfully. Everybody was on IRC. And a few people started to poke fun at his talk, and they were like, why is this guy even here? Like, what does this have to do with Ruby? He just used Ruby to control a robot, as if that wasn't cool enough. And the community piled on those people. And they were like, we are nice. Why are you not being nice? This is cool. Robots are cool. What is wrong with you? Like, why would you say something mean about this guy? He's going to come to his IRC later and see that people have said mean things, and that's not cool. And I think that there's something to be said for being nice, and then there's something really to be said for being sort of a champion for niceness. I'm a bad example. That's why I point to Bork Dude and people like that. But I think that that is a great space to enter into with the Clojure community if you can. I think that's our last question. So thanks, everybody.